Hey, I'm Sasan Kasravi. This is Proteus Debate Academy. If you're watching this video, I nailed this on my first try. So that's exciting. Wow, what a time to be alive. This is a debate video that I've been meaning to make for pretty much as long as we've had this channel. And really, it's kind of the start to a conversation. So I think game design is something that debaters don't know a lot about. I'm going to be eating grapes while I make this because I'm a professional. Debate is a game, just objectively speaking, right? It meets the definition of a game. And many people have opinions on how that game should function and what the rules of it should be. But the vast majority of people don't know anything about game design. This lecture, PowerPoint, I don't know what you would call it. This video is meant to start a conversation. Let's get into that. So here's a little bit about who I am. I don't find this stuff particularly interesting. But if you do, feel free to pause and then decide to keep watching or don't. The other thing that I want to mention is that I'm not a game designer. I am a debate coach. I've been doing that for a long time. I'm pretty good at it, and I've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about debate, a lot of which has been on this channel. So, who's this video for? Anybody who's interested in debate and how it works, I guess, but it's going to be addressing a perspective that you might not have. And that perspective is that debate could be better than it is now, or needs to be better than it is now. Could be, I think, is too broad. I think that is a perspective that a lot of people share, and regardless of I'm not even necessarily endorsing that opinion, right? I'm just approaching this video from that perspective. So with that having been said, let's say like you love the way your debate event works right now and you're not that curious about understanding like how rules and systems and design play a role in that. Not necessarily an important video for you to watch, right? I don't want anyone to watch this and think like, my goal here is to tell people why something they like is bad. It's not my goal. But if you want to come up with a new kind of debate event or advocate for rule changes in a debate event, understand why debates are the way they are, from a game design perspective, or just like debate and are curious to learn a little bit more about game design through this lens of something you already know about, I think this will be an interesting video. And the last thing here is a lot of the examples that we're going to talk about, a lot of the concepts that we're going to talk about are going to rely on us needing some rule, something that we are trying to either encourage or discourage in debate. And you will get to this, but knowing what we want to encourage is a lot harder than knowing what we want to discourage. For the purposes of this video, we are imagining that we think speed in debate, like spreading, like talking very quickly, is something that we don't want. For the sake of these examples, all the principles work independently of that. This is just an example to get that, get those points across. Okay. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff in this video. And there's the potential that at some point you're like, how is this relevant to debate? What does this have anything to do? Where is this going? So here's basically what we're going to cover, and hopefully there'll be timestamps, down here for you to just jump to something that is more interesting to you. But we're going to have to start by talking about game design in general and understanding like what game design is and what role it plays in the finished product of like a game that somebody engages with and interacts with. I will talk about like, I didn't know what to call this section, but basically policy debate and how certain trends started to develop and what trends started to develop, and trying to understand, taking that as a case for debate not functioning in a particularly intended way. Whether that's good or not is something we'll explore later. But just as a case study for debate used to work a certain way, and then one day it didn't. And what does game design have to do with that? We'll talk about role-playing. I mean, this is a concept that some people are familiar with in debate. We sometimes use the word LARP for somebody that debates in a traditional framework of debate, which is I am pretending I am a policy maker. And other aspects of role-playing in debate and how that interacts with the rules. We're going to talk about rules and rule-making, different kinds of games. What kind of game do we want debate to be? And then what are the challenges around making rules for that? We're going to talk about, whether in a given scenario it's effective to just make a rule that fixes something, or if you sort of have to baby bathwater the situation and just design a new event. And we'll talk about a concept that I can't really summarize in a couple words here called Ludonarrative Dissonance, but what it basically has to do with is identifying what is the spirit of your game. What is the event, the debate event that you want? What is that centered around? What is the point of that event? And how do you make it so that the point of that event is the same as what that game actually motivates and rewards people for doing? A lot of this is hypothetical and weird and whatever, but we have a whole, you've seen how long this video is. I don't know yet, but I imagine it's kind of long. But we'll get into it. So let's talk about game design. Is there anything important that I didn't say going in? This lecture is, I want people to listen to it and think about, what we could be doing differently in debate, which is, I think, a discussion we don't have as often as we should, and we don't have at the level that we need to. And this, my hope is that this video will cover at least the basics that someone who wants to be a part of a real meaningful discussion about, debate rules and debate events, you cover the basics that somebody needs to understand in order to be a productive member of that discussion. Let's talk about game design first. So what is game design? Game design is creating a set of decisions for a player. So a game is anything with a win condition. We talk about this in some of our other videos, but maybe you haven't seen those. Basically, by nature of there being a winner and loser and a set of rules that determine that winner or loser, whatever that system is, for the sake of this, we're going to call it a game. And game design is designing the choices and interactions that a player has with that system. So we're going to use a game here as an example. This game is No Man's Sky. Came out in 2017, something like that. And I remember I was really looking forward to this game. I say I remember, that's a really long time ago. I'm 31 now. It's 26. It's not that long ago. No Man's Sky, the premise was that you would be exploring a galaxy-sized galaxy. So you'd be playing and you'd be on a planet, and that planet would be the size of a planet, and you could explore the whole planet. But not only that, you could go to billions and trillions, and in fact, I think quintillions of planets, all of which are different than what anybody else who's been in this game has seen because of the sheer scale of it, and it's about exploring. So game design is distinct from like designing things that go in the game. I know that can be a little bit semantically confusing, but if we take a look at this picture of the screenshot of the game, there's like a tree, and that tree is designed. A visual designer will design the way it looks, or at least tell the computer the parameters around which it should randomize to make a tree. That's not what we're talking about, right? That is what we would call like an asset or a model, or maybe even like a level, right? That is the stuff that is in the game. But the design of the game has to do with how you interact with that stuff. And so when we say that No Man's Sky is a really big game about exploring, the design level is what makes it about exploring and not just a bunch of stuff that's there. So the main way of thinking about like what is game design, how do people interact with it, the main interaction that people have with a game is with something we call a gameplay loop. So every game, no matter how simple or complex, is a series of actions that a player is asked to take, or problems that they have to solve, or decisions that they're presented with. Normally, and especially with complicated games, these go in cycles. So to take like a medium complex game, like let's say Tetris, right? Tetris starts, and you first take in, if you know how to play Tetris, the first thing you're looking at is what the pieces that are at the bottom look like. And you're looking for gaps, you're looking for like, what am I looking to fill? After that, you get a piece, or you look at the piece you already have, and you're determining, okay, based on this piece, how can it fit there to accomplish that goal? And if it can't accomplish that goal, what is the closest it can get, or the least damage it can do? Then you have to maneuver the piece to the area that you want. And after that has happened, well, now you have a different layout at the bottom because the piece is there. And you have to now take in from the top, what is this formation that I'm looking at? What are the gaps that need to get filled? What is the piece that I have? Where should it go? Then you try to get it there. That's a loop that eventually either leads to you winning the game or failing and losing the game, right? But that cycle happens over and over again. And this happens in every game. It happens in sports. It happens in everything, right? It's a cycle, a series of decisions. So I used No Man's Sky as the example earlier because when the game came out, I was really disappointed with it. Not because of the reason that a lot of people were disappointed with it. A lot of people complained that, like, they said it would be multiplayer and it wasn't multiplayer, or that there wasn't a lot of stuff to do. None of that stuff was my problem. When the game was getting released, or being advertised in production, a lot of people were saying, well, I don't understand how this is a game. Like, it seems just kind of like an art piece or a tech demo. But how is this a game? How do you win? How are you interacting? What is the gameplay loop? And I don't have any way of knowing this is true, but I genuinely believe that the people who were making the game didn't have anything really in mind. They put out this first little trailer or whatever, and the game got way more attention than they expected, and then all of a sudden they were like, shit, we need to make a game. So on top of this sort of game that they were already building, based on exploring and stuff like that, they're like, now we need to actually build a game that has a beginning, middle, and end, and a gameplay loop. So here's the gameplay loop for No Man's Sky. Starting at the top of basic resources, you started like a spaceship, you're on some planet, and it's random. If you start the game 100 different times, you're in 100 different places. And you have to find basic resources because you're on foot and you have a spaceship that doesn't have power, it doesn't move. You need to take those resources, and with that you can build certain tools. those tools will help you build advanced resources which power your spaceship. And you can use that spaceship to travel to the next place. And eventually your stuff runs out. And so you have to gather the new resources and then maybe upgrade the better tools because the next place you have to travel, like the bar keeps rising, right? But you still are gathering resources to build tools to develop advanced resources which you use to travel somewhere. Eventually, you travel to the center of the galaxy, and if you do that, you win the game. So I think that this game was terribly designed. And I think the failure of the game... So the game came out, a lot of people complained, and since then, in the years since it's come out, they've put out a ton of free updates, and a lot of people love the game now. I haven't played it, because the game that they turned it into is nothing like the game that they initially were making. And so let's take a look at that. So No Man's Sky fails at being a large game. Not because the levels aren't big. You can see here Skyrim is a game that a lot of people think of still as a quintessentially large game. That was 15 square miles. Red Dead Redemption 2 came out a lot more recently. That was 29 square miles. For the record, New York City is 300 square miles. So they're not 1/6 of just one city, but they're kind of representing entire continents or, states or something like that. No Man's Sky said it would have planet-sized planets. It doesn't. The largest planets are about the size of the San Francisco Bay Area. But, one, that's still massive. That's like 5,000 square miles on average per planet. And there's, what does it say here? 18 quintillion planets. So the amount of space that you have to explore and play on is absolutely massive. So then, why does the game fail at being good? Well, it's because the gameplay loop is very small. When you start on some random part of some planet, or let's say you run out of resources somewhere, right? You need to be able to get to the next thing on foot before the player gets bored. So what that means is no matter where you are on any planet in the entire galaxy, you need to have the same basic resources in your immediate vicinity. So you could go to any part of any planet. You're never like in a giant volcano, in the middle of the ocean, in a desert. You're in a place that has a mix of hills, trees, animals, water, and a basically even distribution of resources. And at that point, like, what's the point in exploring, right? Like, if you go 3 hours to the north, it's the exact same as where you were just now. And so why do that? And so you kind of just hop from planet to planet, don't explore any of them, and then you reach the end of the thing. And I would imagine that the amount of space, actual, like, landscape that the average player actually explores and looks through is not particularly large or, frankly, interesting. So that is the way that the design of No Man's Sky fails at the goal of being a large exploring game, whereas the assets and the levels of No Man's Sky had all of those things present. So how does that relate to debate? Well, debate has loops of things that we do. And when we're thinking about like a debate event that we want, we think about things like, how difficult is it to research? How much research do you have to do to write a case? What do the cases need to be like? What's the length and structure of a case, of a round, of a tournament? What's coaching like? Can a regular teacher become a coach, or does it have to be like a specialized person? Do you need to travel? What are the costs? How available is coaching or judging? Is it difficult to compete in or judge or to coach? Is it a very small event with a few people, or is it a large event with lots of people? How educational is it? And what's the likelihood that a school administration or some organization is going to want to like fund this activity? those things are things that we can sit down and write out exactly what we want, but ultimately these are goals, and these goals will be determined by the details of how the game is actually designed and functions, right? We don't, in other words, there is every game will eventually become like its optimal self, right? Like just sort of lead down a path that the design itself is leading people to. So No Man's Sky, no matter how much the designers want you to like explore around every corner, if there's no design incentive or reward for that, in fact, if the game punishes you for doing that unintentionally, then players are just not going to do it. Or it'll be a challenge to try to make that happen. Here, all of these things are goals that we can set, but the design of the game itself is going to determine which of these things happen. On the other hand, if we have like a design element and don't really understand that element very well, we're kind of just gonna find out what our debate event is going to be like. So let's talk a little bit about debate and how it got here. Now, I had a slide in here initially that talked about like the grand history of debate and whatever. I don't think that's important. Debate's been around for thousands of years, but effectively, as far as we are talking about academic debate with rules and winning matters and schools compete against each other, that can get traced back to pretty much policy debate. So there's a great PDF that I found online that is of this paper that is about the history and statistics of the National Debate Tournament. It's the championship debate tournament in policy debate, one of them, from 1946 to 2005 when it was written. And it's super interesting. There's a lot of really cool stuff here. Let's take a look. First thing is the schedule. You'll notice a lot of things that are a little bit strange in this schedule compared to like the regular schedule now. First of all, they say dinner is at noon and supper is at 6:30. Did dinner used to mean lunch? I didn't know this until looking at this. Maybe more significantly is that round 1 is at 2 p.m. and round 2 is at 3:30. So that means the rounds they have an hour and a half between them, which for a policy debate now is very, very little time. For a lot of debate events now, it's a little time. So shorter debate rounds than what we might be used to now. They also have some weird stuff like movies at War Department Theater and the formal dance. But you can see like, okay, it was a whole weekend affair, but maybe it's longer or shorter or whatever than what we're used to seeing now. Here, I thought was interesting, and maybe you can read this, maybe you can't. It talks a little bit about certain trends in how people debated then. And, you know, I really like that it says what judges reward, debaters try to deliver, because that is the core of what we are talking about, right? Like what the game rewards is what players will try to do. And you either dictate very, very specifically what the game has to reward, or you sort of make it looser and see what happens. And we'll talk about both of those approaches. And this author contributes the differences between old debate and new debate to be, you know, a difference between whether we're looking at like a rhetorically, like persuasive rhetoric or like evidentiary rhetoric. I don't really have a lot of thoughts on this, and ultimately I think it's a little bit irrelevant, because it's, as long as you don't have a say in how a judge examines that debate, who knows if in 5 years it'll be a completely different kind of rhetoric that determines like who's winning, right? It's not something that we can design for if we're not in control of it. This is interesting. So a lot of times people think of like the good old days of debate, and I don't know that there's anybody in I mean, there's definitely some folks who've been doing debate for a very, very long time. And I've met and talked to a couple of them at stuff like FirePie, where it's like, oh, like, they are in their 70s and they've been involved in collegiate debate since their 20s. So they know, like, 50, 60 years of history. But 1982 was 40 years ago. Like, not a lot of people debated 40 years ago. And as far as, like, the good old days of debate, as far as policy goes or whatever, by 1982, speed was significant. And technical debate and it being far removed from, like, a persuasive, rhetorical, whatever thing that people tend to imagine debate used to be like back in the day, whether they're imagining like 5 years ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago. As far as policy debate goes, it goes back a very long time. It says here that in 1982, one of the schools asked if their school president could watch the final round. And so the people who were running the tournament were just like, you know what? There's no time limits for this debate, for the constructives at least. I'm not going to reread it. But you can go as slow as you want so that this person understands. And this person comes in, is interested in the topic, sits down, listens to the first couple speeches, and walks out during cross-ex. So as far as, like, the, you know, appeal to the lay person, like, debate has been like this for a very, very long time. Not every debate has been like this. Not every format of debate's been like this. It says here that they made CETA to try to counteract this and was more popular than regular policy for a little bit, and then, you know, they ended up getting combined. You should read it. It's a whole thing. It's interesting. But most debate events that weren't like this, right? Well, they didn't sit down and think, okay, how do we make a new game of debate? Most debate events are modeled after something, which we will get to in just a second, right? Oh, man, this is a while ago. I'll talk about modeling in a second. What else do we have to talk about here? This is some more back in the day stuff. So you see here that they ask debate coaches and judges, like, what do you think the biggest, what's the phrase they use? Major faults with debate are. And in the 40s, everybody's like, not enough focus on research, too much focus on being, like, rhetorical. And in the late 90s, like 50 years later, it was way too much focus on evidence, not enough focus on being persuasive. This, to me, indicates that the game is not well designed, right? I mean, I know rules changed in those 50 years, but this is the main concept that I want to get across, right? That the game can be way too persuasion and rhetoric focused. It can be way too evidence focused. And there's nothing inherently in the rules that leads it to be a specific way that we want it to be. We don't seem to have a lot of great intentional control of these things. Here we have a little bit about what changed, the critique stuff. You can pause there. I thought it was interesting. Because we're using speed as an example of how things develop. So here you can see a word count for every team in the entire debate of the national finals of various years. And this PDF is actually really cool because it has the transcript for most of these debates. It's actually awesome. And there's some really interesting statistics here. The two most important for me are that they break down the words per minute and they break down the percentage of the speech which was quoted evidence. So we'll see here that it starts around 200 words per minute, which is pretty conversational. I would say I'm probably talking 200 words per minute right now. And you see that holds true for most of, I mean, we're going all the way through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then around 1975, there's the first, I would say, significant uptick in speed. And that corroborates with the time frame for what people consider to be when, like, modern debate and, like, more, like, technical debate started taking off, was in the 70s. You'll also see here that the pretty low percentages, teen percentages of the speeches were reading evidence. In fact, in this year, the winning team only quoted 5% of their speech. But that portion ticks up significantly to where in 90, almost 50% of the speeches were just reading other people's words, just reading evidence. And that's not in the AF and neg case. That is throughout the whole debate. And the speed has significantly gone up. This is 329 words per minute for the winning team. Also keep in mind that this is now like 32 years ago. So this trend has continued in that time. And I promise you that the words per minute have gone up. So let's put that into perspective. When they were taking notes in 1982, they were taking notes by hand. I think computers in debate are relatively recent in the grand scheme of things, but also some events just still don't have them. For example, NPDA recently passed a rule, and I mean like last school year, that people are allowed to use laptops. This is something that Paul's talked about because he was a major advocate for that because he got carpal tunnel trying to take notes in NPDA debate. Let's explore why that might be. Here is the world record fastest writer in the world. So this person, and do I have sound on here? This girl is writing right now, and she writes 132 numbers in 1 minute. Now, she's just writing the digits out, but I did a little bit of math based on the number of characters that she's writing, the average numbers of characters per word, and this is 60 words per minute, and that's what that sounds like. Why isn't this making any sound? This is making sound. Well, this is a really exciting part of the video. Why don't we just go to here? Is this gonna make sound? Okay.
Will you arrive early tomorrow to testify?
This is the
His
fastest
testimony
that a human being
should
can write. If you
clear
can listen
the
to this
defendant.
and write every
The
word that she is
witness
saying without using any
is
shorthand,
telling the truth.
you would be the fastest
Have
writer in the world.
you been witnessing the changes?
Let's take a look at computer-assisted and tool-assisted note-taking. So this is the world record for courtroom stenography. Courtroom stenographers use special keyboards that allow them to type faster than somebody can with a QWERTY keyboard, with a regular keyboard. This is the fastest world record, 370 words per minute.
Begin. Good morning, my name is Mary, and I will be asking you some questions today.
Good morning.
What type of vehicle were you driving that day?
A 2012 Nissan.
And do you remember how the weather was that day?
I don't recall at this time.
Okay, what time of the day did this take place?
I don't recall the time.
Did you see the driver of the other vehicle that hit you before the collision took place?
Not the driver, but the vehicle.
And so that I don't specifically testify, what's the speed limit on the highway?
60 miles an hour.
And were you traveling the speed limit at the time of the collision?
I believe around there, or just a little bit less.
Okay, and sorry if this is a silly question.
So that's pretty fast, but the thing is that is a digitally sped up recording, and digitally sped up recordings are a lot easier to understand because the enunciation is still perfect. A human being that tries to speak at 370 words per minute is going to be significantly harder to understand. So here is Brenna, a former competitor of mine, mostly coached by, I think still coached by Paul. And she sent in a video of her reading a passage. I measured her words per minute to be 375. She is very fast for MPDA, but with respect to her, not the fastest debater who's ever lived, right? Like, this is very high speed, but by no means is this the fastest debate ever goes. So keep in mind that the 60 word per minute recording you heard is the fastest someone can write by hand. This is the speed that debaters in a final round of MPDA, when you were expected to write down things by hand, were able to speak. Is this going to have sound? Nope. Is there a way to fix that? Oh, there we go.
I'm often asked about how clearly we speak influences how well others understand. If you speak clearly, speech can be the reason why people understand. The problem is you speed up, it gets harder for you to speak clearly. If you drop your word edges and everything mumbles together, people might have a hard time understanding you. But if you're able to maintain crisp enunciation despite your quick place, your listeners should never have a problem. More importantly, speed how you choose your group or turn your words. Make sure they're paused no matter how short or illogical places. You should pause according to punctuation after phrases or clauses.
So that is actually very good. Her enunciation is very good. But in terms of like the power creep in speed, I think that gives a good example of it. How do we... Oh, hold on. I have to get this looking right again. Go here, and then we go here, and then we exit, and we're good. Okay.
Begin.
Good
morning, my name is...
Okay.
I'm often...
Okay. It's not just speed, though. It's also, like, the content has changed. If you look at this transcript from the first affirmative case of the winning team in 1949, it's basically a regular speech. It's an essay. It's something someone would talk about. And it looks vastly different than a debate case would look now. So these are the changes that have happened over time. I posit that these changes have not changed in a designed and intentional way. It might be that the things that they produced are better than the way things were before, but the purpose of this video is, if we want debate to be a particular way, how do we keep things like this from happening? A lot of debate events' answer to that is modeling, and the vast majority of debate events do this. So what modeling is you take an existing thing and you say, well, do this. So people might think, look at the last slide and be like, well, why can't we just make a debate event and tell people, okay, well, do this. Don't do the fast thing, do this instead. Not allowed to do the fast thing, must do this. That would be an example of modeling. So Student Congress is modeled after Congress, Parliament's modeled after Parliament, Public Forums modeled after the CNN show Crossfire, Lincoln Douglas is modeled after the Lincoln Douglas debates. The thing with modeling, though, is that you're not creating a set of rules that necessitate, that naturally lead to a certain kind of behavior. You are just asking people to engage in a certain kind of behavior. And you're essentially asking people to role play, which is where we get into role playing. So,
How do you win this game anyway? There's no winning. It's like life. You don't win at life.
That's from E.T. I don't know if you could hear it very well, but it's talking about how you can't win D&D. And that's the idea. Most role-playing games don't have a winning-losing situation. Debate's unique in asking us to, not entirely unique. There's other similar events like, I don't know, Model UN or like Moot Court. We'll talk about that right now. So a role-playing game is a game that asks you to behave in a way that isn't necessarily the way you would behave in that situation. So maybe it wants you to pretend there's different circumstances. Maybe it wants you to pretend that you have certain motivations that you don't normally do, that there's certain stakes that there aren't really currently. And a lot of these games include some sort of etiquette. Traditional debate, tons of like unwritten rules of etiquette and how you speak and how you present, and really a lot of stuff that is like fodder for like critiques nowadays, right? But that is what I mean by role playing. It's this idea that you have a standard that you're expected to meet, and the game is go meet the standard. There's a couple problems with this, in that there's not a lot of competitive role-playing games. I mean, we're going to talk in a second about, like, let's say you make that rule. Can you actually enforce that rule? Like, how do you make somebody do that? But even just at a basic level, like, a competitive role-playing game has certain fundamental flaws, in that if you're being asked to not do something the way you would do it, like, for example, let's say it's a Civil War reenactment, and you are isn't the North like at an advantage, like they won, right? So it's a question of, okay, if I'm asked to make choices the way somebody else would have made those choices, and I lose, like, how much of that is the role I was given and the strengths and weaknesses of that role, and how much of it is like my strengths and weaknesses as a player. If you think of like a fighting game, you might think of like a character that has certain strengths and weaknesses and another character, and some characters are just better at the game than other characters. But in a role-playing game, you're asked to choose to play that way. You're asked to choose to be less competitively successful in order to keep up this facade of the roleplay, which isn't that common. That's a clip from Conan O'Brien playing 1800s rules baseball, which is a thing. People play baseball intentionally under 1800s rules. And what happens if there is a play or a type of approach to the game which could win you the game, but it was after 1850 whatever, 1870 whatever. So, like, you're now limited from being able to do that. And that's not inherently a game without merit, but it is something worth, it is a nuance to be taken into consideration with role-playing. So let's get into actual rules, right? Like, let's say, okay, we want you to debate in this specific way. How would we do that? Well, the role of rules is to limit the actions that someone can take. And you can say you're not allowed to do this, you may do this, you have to do this, right? And rules can be rigid or flexible, which I'll talk about. But a good set of rules says, here is the rules. Everyone understands this. Now everyone go out and do everything you can do to win that does not break these rules, right? In other words, if it's not against the rules, for good competition, it should be encouraged. Now, rules change, and we're going to talk about that a lot. But this is, I think, a beautiful example of this. The Washington Generals. The Washington Generals are they're not a fake basketball team, but they are the basketball team that plays against the Harlem Globetrotters. So the Harlem Globetrotters are like a demonstration basketball team. They like do stunts, they do all sorts of weird tricks with the ball, and they goof around on the court. And there is a team that they play against called the Washington Generals. And every night the Globetrotters win. What most people don't know is that the Washington Generals, on the vast majority of nights, are there trying to win the game. They just always lose. There's a set of rules that says, you know, when the Globetrotters have the ball, you have to let them do their thing. You can't get in the way of them putting on a show. But when you have the ball, you are playing traditional basketball. You are trying to score. You're trying to win. And the people who are in the Washington Generals are talented basketball players. In fact, I think the Globetrotters are making a bid to become an NBA team. But in 1971, the Globetrotters lost to the Washington Generals for, I think, their third time ever, but the other 2 times were in like the 40s and 50s and stuff. And I think that speaks to like what I'm talking about. Right? I think that makes the game exciting. I think that makes it be more than like your job is to lose. Like at least there's a set of rules and people can as long as you can imagine something within the set of rules and you work hard enough for it, you succeed. It's not predetermined who is supposed to win or supposed to lose in a way that debate feels like a lot of the time. There's a lot of like inequities in debate and a lot of like biases and stuff like that affect people. And I think there's a reason why a lot of the history of people challenging norms in debate comes from people who weren't able to succeed under those norms because of like being a part of some minority group, right? Let's take a look at this game, which you may or may not have seen before. If you're younger, you probably haven't. It's called Ultimate Ninja. It's not popular like everybody was playing, but it was heard of. And it's a game where, I won't explain all the rules, but basically you take turns trying to swing at somebody's forearm. And you're not allowed to move when it's not your turn unless you die. Whatever. The reason I'm pointing this out is because this video is from a championship round of a Ultimate Ninja League that happened among the Ivy Leagues. So in that video are representatives from Harvard, Stanford, whatever other major school. I went to community college. I don't know the names of these schools. But the point is that this is an interscholastic competition where people are competing in Ultimate Ninja. Well, a lot of what you'll notice, though, is like, well, one, there's no like referee, and a lot of this stuff is sort of like enforced through like good faith. So I think right here, one guy is going to try to move his arms away. Somebody calls him out on it and moves it back. Let's take a look. It's right over here. Oh, there it is. Nope, you're not allowed to do that, and he has to move it back. So this is a flexible game. It's not a rigid game in that you can sort of enforce these rules as you sort of go. I imagine Quidditch games being kind of like this, right? I imagine a lot of games are sort of soft, rigid. Most games that kids play with each other, a lot of casual games that you play, casual video games, right? The difference is, well, I'll just get to this now. So why can't we just make a game of debate that has sort of good faith? Or just like unrigid rules and not have to specifically detail everything out? Well, that's because in casual games, you get to choose who you play with, right? Like, if somebody plays in a way that you think is unfair or not fun or violates the spirit of the game, you just don't play the game with that person. But in an academic activity, but also two, a game where you want it to be competitive, you want it to be a legitimate claim that you are the best in the country at this, you have to let anybody compete with any strategy that is permitted by the rules. So what you'll probably need for that is something that's rigid. So rigid rule enforcement would be something like Magic the Gathering, right? Every single card says exactly what it does on it. There's no room for interpretation. But usually there's no room for interpretation. And exactly what you must do and may do and when and what order it happens in is dictated. And because of this, there's a very, very clear meta in Magic the Gathering, right? There's very clearly like good decks and the best deck that you can have, and this deck beats that deck, and that stuff is figured out very quickly. And that's something that happens when rules are really rigid and people don't have a lot of options in what they can do. And games that are like that usually tend to incorporate either elements of chance or frequent changes to the game to keep it interesting. That's why like Magic has like new cards come out all the time, and different variations on the game, and so to keep things interesting. But if it was like very, set, you would have a game be under one rule set, and really the only way to succeed is to gradually improve your skill in that, which is not unheard of, right? We could have a debate event like that. It would be something like sports, which is, I think, what we're talking about next. So first I want to talk about like simple sports, right? And again, all of these flexible rules, like, do we want debate to be like Ultimate Ninja? Do we want it to be like Magic the Gathering? Do we want it to be like Olympic track and field sports? Olympic track and field sports don't change very often. And as far as like the spirit of the game, something we're going to talk about later, they have a very simple spirit of the game. And that is, like, in the high jump, who can jump the highest? Like, can you jump really high? There don't tend to be a lot of controversies and new strategies. Now, obviously, a lot of you will know about the high jump, will know that there was a revolutionary strategy in the high jump that was controversial, and that was the Fosbury flop. But just taking a look over here on the right real quick, the chronology of records in the high jump is, there's times that are relatively exciting, but there hasn't been a record in approaching 30 years in the high jump, even after, new innovations. But if you look, there is some change. So initially, a lot of these jumps tend to be like purely vertical, and then gradually you start to see people go sideways a little bit more, as they just figured out, like, actually, if you go sideways, you can kind of get higher. And before you were all the way backwards with the Fosbury flop, people were doing that. I think at this point, we're probably in the Fosbury flop. And now people have figured out, actually, you have to run up and jump backwards over it. But still, this is a significantly changing event, but it's very simple. And the only way to get better at the game and have an edge over somebody else is to either discover a completely new strategy or to just win the genetic lottery and work really, really hard. This is an interesting game. Well, it's the long jump, right? The long jump actually also had a Fosbury flop. But it was banned because the person who invented it did it before the Olympics. And the Olympics saw that and was like, we're banning this because it was allegedly too dangerous. But you'll see here, there was a record set I think it's 68, that stood for 23 years. And then in whatever years after that. Then that got broken, and that record has not been broken since. And that's, I think, going on like 30 years. And the strategy is to do a front flip as you are long jumping. And actually, people estimate that if long jumpers were allowed to do this, it would shatter the long jump record. So this is something to think about. Like, do we want debate to be something that is a very simple thing that has very little room for strategy, dynamics, chance, stuff like that? I suspect that we don't. I mean, the high jump and the long jump are not particularly exciting events, and not a lot of people who aren't already good at them want to play them. I want a game where somebody who isn't good at the game yet is interested in playing and is, encouraged to improve. So then we can look at more complex sports. A complex sport is, let's say, a team sport, right? Like football, basketball, hockey, soccer, something like that, right? And they tend to balance like skill and strategy, right? So you can have a less skilled team win because of a strategy, but also team balance has changed a lot. If you win the basketball championship or whatever, you're less likely to get a really, really good draft pick. If you do very badly, you're more likely. There's salary caps to try to make it so that a team can't just buy all the best players. But there's also, the sport is also built around an audience. So when you're talking about like the long jump, right, and you're making rules, how do we make a good rule for the long jump? You know what it is that you're trying to accomplish. what is the spirit of the game football? What is football trying to accomplish? Well, football is just trying to get the audience watching more football and going to games and sitting through the commercials, right? And so by having an audience, you have a third party other than just the rule makers and the athletes. And the athletes get paid because there is an audience, right? And so they don't get to just say, well, I don't like this rule or I don't want to do this. They want to do whatever is going to, they're encouraged or systemically motivated to do whatever it is going to give them the most audience success, right? That's not 100% the case, but it is the case. And same with rule makers, right? They're not just sitting down and trying to make a decision based on what they think the game should be. They are going to make it based on what makes the game better to watch. And there's a lot of like kind of modest innovations that have happened in, say, basketball because of a like audience perspective. The shot clock. The game was boring to watch and too defensive. The backcourt violation. But also stuff like, I don't know, dribbling didn't used to be allowed, and then people started doing it, and it was technically allowed under the rules because you're passing it to yourself. You weren't allowed to move with the ball, but people were like, I'm passing it to myself, and the rules say you can't. There's nothing that says a dog can't play basketball. You know, there's the question of when you are the, you know, college basketball, whatever, NBA, let's say, is a better example. How you determine what to do in that scenario is significantly motivated by an audience, which debate doesn't really have. It used to, in that book, you know, it talks about like televised debates in the 50s on CBS and stuff like that. But debate doesn't have an audience currently. And there's other challenges to making rules around debate. So why can't we just make rules the same way that we're making games, like video games or card games or sports, for debate? Regardless of which of these models we think we most want debate to be like. Well, the first reason is that we can't limit what somebody does in a debate round nearly as effectively as we limit what they do in video games, or as effectively as how we limit it in sports. There's no referee in the round. The judge isn't like blowing a whistle, stopping things and saying like, okay, start over. It's usually somebody who just picks a winner at the end, which is different than a referee. And also, whatever that judge says goes. So if they liked somebody and they said, hey, I think this is the winner, that person's going to win the round. There's very little anyone can do about that other than not hire that judge for the tournament, which is like, how do you know that they're going to make some sort of decision? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Or if they make some sort of decision that you think is against the rules, not just like, I don't like that, but explicitly like harmful or against the rules, then you file a protest with the tournament. And the tournament almost never actually does something about that. There's another round that has to happen. It's a very like tense time crunch, but also the decision is made by people who weren't in the room. And like, there's really no evidence. Like, you're like, oh, my opponent accessed the internet. And you're like, Jimmy, did you access the internet? And they're like, no. But like, Johnny is saying he saw him do it. And the judge is like, I didn't see him do it. So like, what is the tournament supposed to do, right? There's not a lot. I've filed a protest, I think, 3 times in my 10 years of debate coaching. And 2 times I got, I think 3 times I basically got, hey, we're sorry that happened, but there's really nothing we can do. And there's no audience. So there's no profit incentive or outside incentive. Like, we are guiding these rules around the entertainment of these people. So it's also difficult to build a rule because it's hard for us to agree on like what outcomes we want. If one debater wants the debate to be fast and another wants to be slow, one judge wants it to be fast, one wants it to be slow, it's really hard to like navigate making a rule for that. Whereas if there was like a clear profit incentive for debate being one way or the other. It'd be less. Or just at least an audience perspective, or even just a set goal. We are trying to accomplish blank. If we had a guiding principle that everyone doing debate was agreed upon, then it would be an objective question. We can measure, are we reaching this, are we accomplishing this or not? But shy of that, it's very difficult to have those discussions. So let's talk about like reforming versus rebuilding, right? So let's say there's a debate event and there's some trend you don't like, speed, whatever. How effective is it to make a rule that tries to fix that versus like a new debate event that no longer has that problem and doesn't have that problem emerge? Well, let's take a look. We have a very limited ability to fix problems in debate for a lot of the reasons that I just mentioned. But just to get into it, for one thing, writing rules is really hard. Even in a video game, right? They are constantly balancing like things after, putting it in the game, seeing how it works, and deciding if they're happy or not happy. And the turnaround time for debate compared to like a video game or a sport is extremely slow because we have very, very few samples to look at. I mean, at most, a debater is debating 20 times a month, right? Whereas you would get way, way more data in some other type of game. But even ignoring just, it's difficult to know what the right rule should be. The next level of challenge is you have to convince, before we get into who you have to convince, you have to change it at the highest level first. What do I mean by that? Let's say you want to host a tournament, and that's an invitational tournament, and you have Lincoln Douglas debate. Well, if you want people to go to your tournament for Lincoln Douglas, then you need to give out quals for their state championship or whatever. You need to like be a step in the path of them going to the TOC or the NSDA or the state championship or whatever, right? And that means you need to adhere to the rules of the national tournament. Even in college, where that's not necessarily the case, all of our individual tournaments just model the rules after what is nationals doing. This was super frustrating when we were in California at the community college championship trying to pass a new rule. Because it's March, we're at the state business meeting where you get to pitch rule changes, and no matter what you pitch, people say, does nationals do it that way? And you're like, no, we're going to try to propose this rule in April at nationals, but that's not currently how they do it. And they're like, well, if nationals does it, we will do it the way nationals does it. But if not, we're not going to do it, because what we're trying to do is prepare people for nationals. So what that means is, in order to actually get the rule passed, you have to pass it at the highest level of competition first, and then everything else follows suit after that. It's not 100% the case, but between like bids and quals and just people wanting to go to tournaments to prepare for the next thing, that's very often the case. And when you get there, you go to the tournament and you're trying to like pass this new rule. You're speaking to an audience that mostly doesn't understand the problem you're trying to describe. I mean, like when we were at the Fire Pie National Tournament for community college speech and debate, and you want to pass a rule in debate, 2/3, 3/4 of the people voting in attendance are not debate judges. They're not debate coaches. And you have to get them to understand that there's some problem and that this way of doing things fixes the problem. And there have been times where I was in a debate committee. There's been many times, almost every time we go to a debate committee and we have universal consensus on here's the 3 or 4 rule proposals that we want to make. Some of them interfere with scheduling. Some of them, I don't know. Most of them have nothing to do with any other debates, any other events, any other type of speech, anything else that happens. And the Council of Debate has unanimously agreed to approve this. So you go to the business meeting, and now you have a bunch of people who aren't debate coaches or haven't coached debate in years or didn't show up to the debate meeting, and they're just like, well, that's not really, is that like how we want to do it? Or can you, like, I don't really understand this. And it's like, well, just let us do this. Like, the debate people want to pass this. It only has to do with debate. But the majority of people you're going to have to convince aren't going to be at a level of familiarity to recognize the problem, even if they are debaters, right? I don't know that much about high-level policy debate, right? If I coached for like a policy team and went to a event like this where we're making rules, I would have as much a vote as the people who really, really understand the issue. And I don't know that that makes for very easy rule passing. Because you constantly have to explain the issue to people who don't understand that it exists or how this would solve it. In a meeting that everybody just wants to leave because they don't want it to run long. It's very difficult and very frustrating. But it's also very difficult to enforce rules. For reasons that I kind of already talked about and I won't go on about for too long, but any individual tournament may, on purpose or accidentally, follow your new rule or not follow your new rule, but also, like, everything is at the mercy of a judging pool, which might make a decision the way you want them to or not make a decision. So it's very difficult to take an existing format of debate and just fix it by passing rules, because existing judges are going to follow existing norms or just whatever they want to do. People are going to be hesitant about changing anything. It's very difficult to do. That doesn't mean it's not the best way of doing it. It just means that those are the challenges. On the other hand, you know what? No. Not on the other hand. This is also going into, like, okay, fixing a rule. Like, let's take speed as the example, right? Let's say you want to make a rule that fixes speed. Well, what a lot of people don't understand is that effective debate strategies aren't just loopholes people find. They are the essence of the game and are often rooted in things. They're the natural consequences of things that people wanted to be in the game, but they just didn't anticipate how there would be these consequences down the line. So let's take speed as an example. Speed exists in debate for two reasons, two factors. One is a time limit. So let's talk about that first over on the left here. And time limits inherently incentivize, like, okay, if I'm limited on the amount of time I have to say something, as long as there's a reason for me to say more stuff, I am incentivized to say it faster. And so that creates speed, right? Well, why is there a time limit? One, because we wanted debate to be a verbal debate format. And two, we want it to happen in real time because we didn't have any other options. People have tried to make a asynchronous online debate event. Maybe that's a way to go. And maybe when that's the case, you no longer have time limits for your speeches. Maybe you still do. Because the other reason is that it's judged. And somebody has to sit down, probably by force, and watch this round, even though they're not super interested in what's going on, right? So all of those, the fact that we have like a day that it needs to fit in, and we have to speak, and we have to get this thing over with, and it has to all happen at the same time, generally means that there's time limits. But let's look at the other side of the board real quick. Given that there's time limits, the first thing that inherently incentivizes, in fact, strategically necessitates speed, is cold concessions. What is a cold concession? Cold concession is the idea that if a point isn't challenged, the judge must view it as true. And if that's the case, then you want as many unchallenged points as possible. And so you got to go fast. But why is it that we have cold concessions in debate? Well, the root of that is in judge neutrality. If a judge isn't imposing their own biases into the debate, and Paul and I are having a debate, and Paul says something about I don't know, how a nuclear power plant works. That isn't true. But I don't know that, and I don't say anything about it, right? The judge is given a choice. Take Paul for what he said and just pretend that's the case, or say, I know that not to be the case, and so I will not humor that. Well, there are events like OO or Persuasive or whatever, where a judge is sitting there, and if they don't believe what you're saying is true, they don't have to vote for it, right? In debate, though, we have this notion that it's the judge should be neutral because it's the debaters' jobs to disagree with each other. And if the judge is not being neutral, then we're not really having a spirited competition in the same spirit, right? It's just the judge saying what they think instead of being neutral. But why should they be neutral in the first place? Well, that's because of this notion of switch side debate, right? Which is, I think, the core of many of our debate events, is this idea that the side you are defending is not necessarily the side that you believe, and you don't get to choose this. And so you're going to do your best, and given that, it feels unfair to win or lose solely based on the side you got. So because your side isn't under your control, we have this notion that you should still have a fair shot at winning the debate despite which side you think is more true, or the judge thinks is more true, right? If the judge agrees with the AF on the topic and you get neg, and that's all it takes to win the debate, that doesn't feel fair, right? But that necessitates judge neutrality, which inherently justifies cold concessions being a thing, which then incentivizes speed. So this is an example of how, like, the design of a debate event from starting principles will create certain strategies that inherently work. And it's very difficult to then say, like, oh, a rule, just don't be fast. Like, NFALD has a rule that says you're not allowed to be fast. And it is a very fast debate event. And people will follow that rule if they want to, not follow that rule if they don't want to. And generally speaking, if your game is rewarding something, people are going to want to do the thing that is rewarded. So the real question is, how do you design a debate event that doesn't reward speed, that rewards whatever it is that we want people to be doing instead? So this gets us into Ludonarrative Dissonance. So let's talk about what that is. Ludo comes from the root for, like, game, I believe, and narrative is like a story, dissonance. So where does this come from? Well, before we get into that, let's talk about Arthur Chu, because I think that's my favorite example of explaining this. Arthur Chu was a contestant on Jeopardy back in the day, 2011, 12, 13, something like that. And he implemented a strategy that he didn't come up with. He'd read about it, and it was known, but not really popularly done on the game, which is, instead of picking a category that you feel confident in and going down the category, which is what the producers recommend you do. There's no rule that says you have to do it that way, but it makes it easier for the audience at home to follow along. If you do, rather than doing that, Arthur Chu would go horizontally, jumping around from category to category, giving him an advantage because he knows what category he's about to call out, but his opponents only have a split second to be like, oh, okay, we're in this category now, and here are the rules for that category. But also, he's looking for daily doubles so that he can put as much money on them as possible and just maximize his chance that he's going to win. And he had a little bit of a streak. He did pretty well, and he won a bunch of games. But in those games, he was not, like, statistically answering the most questions correct or answering the hardest questions. And so there was this whole thing where people were coming out against Arthur Chu hating this guy because he was violating the spirit of the game. But the question is, what is the spirit of Jeopardy? Is the spirit of Jeopardy to be like, who knows the most about these questions? If that's the spirit of the game, then the best way of measuring that is to give a written test with no time limit. Everybody gets the same questions, and then you see who knows the most stuff about this stuff. But that's not the way the game works. The game isn't really about who knows the most stuff. People might think that it is, but it includes different gamic qualities, different design elements that inherently change the dynamics of the game. And that is what ludonarrative dissonance is all about. And for the record, like, a few people after Arthur Chu went and had amazing streaks and won a bunch of games. And people had mixed feelings about it, but they did not get nearly the same amount of backlash that Arthur Chu did. How much does him being Asian have to do with that? I don't know. He, I believe, believes that it does have something to do with that. And again, a lot of people that buck these conventions tend to be people that have been sort of gate-kept out of the existing etiquette and contention, and like conventions and the way things go. And that's just the way it's always been. Tends to be a lot more appealing to people who've historically been in positions of, like, privilege. But let's talk about, like, in the instance of, like, an actual video game. What is ludonarrative dissonance? Ludonarrative dissonance isn't a term. It's not a term coined by Jonathan Blow, but I believe that term was coined after. And there's a really great lecture that I love from 2008, where Jonathan Blow, a game designer that I like a lot, gives a speech called "Conflicts in Game Design." And the premise of this lecture is that we have games that have a story that's about one thing, but the message that the game sends by what it rewards tells a completely different thing. And that these things are inherently in conflict with each other. And as such, he believes games aren't good. It's not a good medium for traditional kinds of storytelling. But we don't have to get into that level of detail about it. He went on to apply a lot of this stuff that he talks about into the game he came out with in 2008 called Braid, which was very highly regarded. And then in 2014 with the game The Witness, which I think is the best designed game of all time. And I think is my favorite. I certainly think is the best game. I think there's really just like sort of nostalgia making me think any other game might be better. You should play it. But he gives the example of Grand Theft Auto 4 in his lecture. I have a better example for my purposes. So in 2006, there was a trailer at E3 for a game called Assassin's Creed, which I was really interested in. I like Prince of Persia. It was by the people that made that. And the premise of the game was that you're an assassin who sneaks around. We can read, this is a 2006 article that I read in 2006, looking forward to this game. And it says that the game appears to be a mix between Prince of Persia and Hitman. And each kill begins with sneaking into position and ends with running, climbing, and scurrying away with your life. It's also a game of options, like figuring out how to get your kill without drawing too much attention and picking the best way out of a tight situation. Now, these are all design goals. These are all, like, choices that the game wants the player to consider. But the actual design of the game is going to determine whether they execute on that or not. So it also says here that there is going to be classic combat, of course, but you won't be able to live long taking more than a couple slashes from guards. So the quicker the kill, the better. Run away if you can, whatever. So they're designing the game. And again, I don't know that this is exactly the way the story went, but I suspect that something very similar to this is that they were like, okay, we actually want to emphasize combat more. We want you to do combat more. And so we don't want combat to be as difficult. We don't want you to die as easily. Why? 3 really good reasons. 1, the combat's fun. The combat system for Assassin's Creed was the first time that I saw this sort of like counter mechanic where you're like surrounded by enemies and you have to sort of time when they're attacking you and you attack one. That became the premise for like the Batman games. That became the like core mechanic in one of the core combat mechanics in some of the new Lord of the Rings games. It's just a fun combat system, and if you have a fun mechanic, people are going to like the game more if you let them do it. The other thing is that you have all sorts of enemies in the game, and they were trying to make it very like historically accurate. So, you know, nobody has a laser gun, nobody can fly, but some people have swords, some people have shields, some people have spears, right? Well, if you're running away from someone, there's no functional difference between those enemies, right? Like, the only option they have is this person that is chasing you is significantly better at chasing. But there's not a lot of historical reason for that, and it just sort of breaks that immersiveness in the game, I guess. And so by having combat focus, well, suddenly shield guy and spear guy like play very differently, and the game has a lot more nuance, and the enemies matter a lot more. And finally, there's not a lot of progression in running and climbing. It's something that you can do from the very beginning of the game, and they wanted you to be able to do it from the very beginning of the game. So then what makes you feel like you're progressing in the game and gives you those sorts of like feeling of reward? Well, new weapons and new like upgrades for your weapons and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that the game that they made is better or worse than the game they set out to make. But by changing these mechanics, they have inherently changed what the game is about, what message the game is conveying. Because this is a random Reddit post that I found after looking this up, but this is exactly what my experience was playing Assassin's Creed, which is just the combat is so easy that you just stand somewhere near your target and then you just start killing guards. And they just send wave after wave of guards at you, and eventually there's just like 16, 20, 30 dead guards on the ground, and then you just walk up to the person you need to stab and you stab them, and that's the end, you know? So there is this like narrative to the game where the story of the game is like, hey, you are Altair, and you are the best sneaker, and you are a master at hiding, and no one sees you get in or out. But when you actually play the game, you're just a murder machine, and everybody in Jerusalem has seen the crimes that you've committed, and this would have been a massive part of the historical record. But so that's ludonarrative dissonance, right? Where there is a dissonance between what the game wants you to be doing and what it's actually rewarding you from doing, or maybe it's punishing you for trying to actually adhere to what rules it wants you to play by. So we have 3 approaches for how to resolve this in debate, right? The first approach is we make debate about something that is really simple. Like, make the game simple and we know what it's about. Like a sprint. A sprint is a very simple game and it's very easy to make rules for. And you don't have to change those rules often. And it's just like, look, the point is running as fast as you can for a short distance. And if we design a debate event like that, if you design a debate event like that, then you could keep it very simple, and then it would be easy to limit the number of factors that make the game about anything else. So let's say your debate event is all about, you think the most important thing in debate is good quality research, right? If that is the case, then removing as many other elements as possible, like cross-examination or whatever, removing as many layers as possible is going to make it a more effective research-focused competition than what a traditional debate format is. To the point where maybe the research game is just you submit some research based on a topic and whoever is the best wins, right? Maybe that's not what we want, right? We talked about how simple games aren't the most exciting or dynamic or interesting or encouraging of people to enter, have fun, and then get a little bit better at. The other option is to do what we've kind of been doing, which is just like come up with a game that seems like it would be a good game and then just find out what the best strategy is. Video games have this happen all the time. Some sports have this happen. And the thing is that, like, again, like if you're happy with the way debate is and it's gone, then maybe this is enough. But it just supposes that we can't have the event function well in a healthy, sustainable, truly competitive way, and still accomplish what we wanted to accomplish. The third option is to get really, really good at game design, which is to understand what it is that we want the game of debate to do, have it be complex, but still design it in a way where the most motivated, the hardest working competitor who is doing everything they can to win is also demonstrating the most of what we want to encourage, and is something for us to like hold up as a trophy of what this event has been able to accomplish. Because I think it's a shame that a debate event like, I don't know, Public Forum 8 years ago exists, where there are students who debate fast and they use technical arguments and whatever, and they work significantly harder to get to that level than a student that doesn't do something like that, right? And we're like, the Public Forum at that time, maybe even still now, is like, okay, who is our most motivated group? Who's working the hardest? Who's trying to spend as much of their time learning debate as much about debate as they can? And then let's tell those people that they're doing it wrong and they're not welcome in this activity and that we don't want them doing debate the way they're doing it, right? What I think a good format of debate should be is something where everyone who is motivated is trying everything they can to try to succeed, and the result, because of the design of the game, is still something that we really value. That's super difficult to do, and that's why this entire video is about the challenges in game design and not solutions. I have a couple ideas, but I think it's more exciting to just get these questions out there and have you guys think about it and you guys discuss, well, here's where I think the real problems are. Here's what I think debate is about and what we should be encouraging. For my money, I get there. For my money, I think like listening is what I would frame stuff around. But let's focus on recap the problems we need to solve, though. I think the first problem that we need to solve if we are making a good debate event or fixing an existing debate event is to reconcile either having more effective rule enforcement, where people are doing whatever they want, however they want to, underneath a mutually agreed upon set of rules that are actually enforceable. I think that's very difficult to pull off, which is why the highlighted one is the one that I think is more likely a solution, but I also don't know the exact answer, which is we have to solve the role-playing problem, which is like the role-playing problem. We have to figure out a way to either make a game where role-playing is inherently what leads to your success. There are events like this, like moot court in law school, right? It's judged by a judge. So if you want to win a case, being the best at treating it like a real case and not like this imaginary court, like that is like rewarded. So like being good at role playing is the meta. We don't have that in debate right now, right? There's no reason why someone who is really good at pretending to be a member of parliament is the better parley debater, right? There's no reason why somebody who's better at pretending to be on CNN's Crossfire is more likely to win a public forum round, because the what that game rewards and what it asks you to try to be are just two completely separate things. So either we have to make role-playing a part of the, like, everyone's trying to role-play still, and that is rewarded, or we have to come up with a game that is somehow not super rigid, is complex, and anyone can do anything they want. I don't know. The next thing is that we have to, design a sustainable and desirable gameplay loop. I'll talk about some of the challenges to doing that in a later slide. But basically, like, whatever we design has to, like, inherently lead to, like, a desirable amount of research time, a desirable round length, all this sort of stuff that I was talking about earlier. And finally, we have to, like, overcome ludonarrative dissonance by either... we talked about keeping the game simple. I don't think that's really... Maybe that's a solution you like. But we either have to build an audience for debate and just have, like, whatever the audience is going to like the most is what we design the rules around. Which there are challenges to, obviously. Or we figure out a way that we're like, okay, what do we want this game to be? What do we think is the essence of it? And how do we design a game where that is the meta? Where, like, the most effective strategy is always doing more of the things that we want. And that's really hard, but I think ultimately would make for a better game. And for my part, as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about this, I'm more interested in exploring those solutions. I think if I were to make a debate game, it would in some way focus around listening, because we have, like, all sorts of speech events that are persuasive and people are writing speeches. Like, let's say extemp. What's the difference between extemp and parley? You get 20 or 30 minutes with a topic and you research it and you present it with an argument and evidence. Well, the difference is that parley and all debate formats are really strongly about, like, listening to what someone else is saying, adapting your strategy to what they're saying, responding to what they're saying, understanding how the judge might process what they are saying and what they might think of it. I think very good debaters tend to also be very careful listeners. And I think that is something that's very special about debate that not a lot of other events do. And so if I were to make a debate event, what I would be looking as one of the core principles I'm going to try to design my game around would be, like, listening. How do we maximize that? How do we build a game where whoever listens the best is structurally advantaged in the game? Whereas in the current debate, listening is really important, but if you're spreading the same, critique you read against every affirmative team or every negative team, or you have, like, a bunch of, like, tricks and traps and whatever, like, you don't have to be responsive or adaptive to each individual opponent to nearly the same degree. Here's some final thoughts. Gone on for a little while now. Hopefully this video records and everything's good. Here's some other challenges to just doing any of this stuff that we're talking about. One, it's really difficult to test debate ideas because it's a lot of work ahead of time for any of these ideas that you want to explore or implement, and you don't have a lot of people to, like, use for practice. some do more than others, but it's just very hard to like play test it alone in a room, right? A major part of like testing your game is giving it to someone and not telling them how to play the game, and just seeing what it is that they try to do and seeing whether the things that they try to do in these scenarios are the things that you want to encourage them to do. And that's very difficult given the sort of scope of debate. The other problem with making a debate event is everybody's a critic. Like, I've had conversations like this with lots of people, and there's a lot of people in debate who have more experience than me and have been around for a lot longer and have a wealth of knowledge that I want to know about. But the thing is that a lot of these people aren't actively sitting around trying to solve these problems and make a new debate event or whatever, like have the same sort of drive to fix things. I think if you talk to them or you make a proposal or you post a suggestion somewhere, they will crawl out of the woodwork and tell you why that idea is dumb or was already done or whatever. But that group of people is, in my experience, relatively less active in like trying to fix stuff. Like, for example, like my old debate coach, like is a professor. Like, he doesn't know what's going on in debate. But if I were to tell him like, hey, I designed a debate event, I think he'd basically just look at it and be like, here's why I don't like it. That's not a problem. That's important, but it is a challenge because it's potentially a little thankless. The other problem is that you're competing with existing models. People have their attention on Public Forum, Lincoln Douglas, or whatever already. They already have events that they really like and have a soft spot for. They have money invested into these things with briefs or travel tournaments that they have coming up or coaches that they hired for this thing. And people have expertise. Like, I was the national champion in Congress debate, and now I get to have a coaching career, if I want, based around the premise of being a national champion in Congress debate. But if Sasan makes a new debate event, I'm just a coach, and I can no longer like advertise that. And so it's, that's an inherent barrier. There's also, constraints on debaters' time that are changing. I don't know if current models of debate can survive very much longer with how demanding they are on competitors' times compared to other extracurricular activities that we have, and then how well can your format adapt to unforeseen circumstances. Like Duo pretty much died during the pandemic because turns out you can't really do that online. And we don't know what other challenges there are. So what's going to happen in 3 years that forever changes the world and now your thing just can't work? And you're doing all of this and hopefully also trying to make your debate event educational, accessible, cheap, and fair. That's very difficult. Here's some reasons why you should try. One, there's a lot of educational and ethical, political needs and demands for a good competitive debate event. I mean, I think a lot of us have the experience of telling someone we do debate and they get this image in their head of how amazing that is, the skill set you must have, and how exciting the rounds might be. Can I watch? And it just, I feel a lot of our experience is tempering those people's expectations and being no, it's not really like that. But there's a massive demand for the version that they imagine. In fact, I think a lot of the funding that is currently going into speech and debate is under the assumption that our activities like that, and it is not really like that at a lot of levels. And so I think there's a lot of demand for a great debate activity that actually accomplishes those things in a meaningful way at a competitive level, right? Where it's not just oh, well, we are big questions. And the difference with big questions is nobody spreads. And the reason they don't is because please don't. There's nothing stopping a big questions debater spreading other than a judge letting it happen and a debate tournament letting it happen or not being able to stop it. And I don't know, I think there's massive potential for one debate event that accomplishes a lot of these things to have a massive impact. The other reason is because there's also a market incentive. For some people, this is a lot more significant than others. I don't really care about the, whatever. I'm not much of a capitalist, but some people are. And the education market is massive and rapidly growing. The market interest in something like debate is massive and growing, like extracurriculars and stuff like that are debate adjacent. There's a lot of money to be made, and let's say you make the perfect debate event, then in theory, a lot of that goes your way. And we probably only really need one great debate event. Most other countries have one format of debate that everyone that does debate in that country competes in. And debate is really, really struggling right now. Not everyone might realize it yet, but if you start looking into the numbers, speech and debate participation is in free fall. And we are fracturing. Maybe reason number 3 why we should try anyway is because I don't see debate surviving too much longer if the resources required of it are so high, the positive, the rate of people having a positive experience with it are decreasing, and it's a massive time suck for competitors. Yeah, I mean, debate's in trouble. And in theory, we could consolidate most of people currently doing debate into 1 or 2 events and have a much more exciting, much more rewarding debate format. Though, of course, the problem with that is anytime you make the one event that you want to be the new standard everybody goes to, you're probably just making the 15th debate event that further splinters the activity. I hope this video works out. I had some technical issues last time I tried recording a video, and this has been going for a very long time. Hope this was interesting. Again, this is a set of problems that I think a lot about. Hopefully, this gets you thinking about those problems. Reach out to me if you'd like. Thank you, Tanya. She went over this with me in a Zoom call earlier and gave me some great feedback. But that's it from me, folks. You have a good new year, and I'll catch you then.